Hello there, welcome back to the channel. This episode is on a ship which you have almost certainly heard of, but we know almost nothing about. And I, as you may know if you're regular to this channel, really like things that we know nothing about because they're fun to explore. Now, people have done videos on this before. In fact, I came across one relatively recently, as in within the last few months anyway, where it was mostly a beta canon and they'd made it up, which was good, but I prefer to stick to canon. So here's what we know about this ship canonically, plus a couple of speculations, shall we say. That ship is, of course, the USS Enterprise XCV 330. This vessel is sometimes simply known as the Ring Ship or the Enterprise Ring Ship. So let's get started. After you, like, share, subscribe, comment down below, and if you enjoyed this video or others on this channel, please hit the bell notification icon because that is the real subscribe button if you want to stay up to date with episodes from this channel. So let's get into it. The Enterprise was a starship of some description, and that's pretty much it. The vessel's size and exact dimensions are completely unknown. There are different reports on different things about this ship. We can chalk this up to two possible explanations as to why there might be different explanations and resources saying why the ship is of different sizes. One is the fact that records from the late 21st and early 22nd century regarding space exploration and starships are pretty vague. There are certain things we know quite a lot about, such as Friendship 1, and then there's things we know pretty much nothing about. Many ships from that era are still floating around by the 24th and 25th centuries, like some of the old J-class freighters and things like that, and Antares class, but actual starships operated by the International Space Agency, which we can presume this vessel was operated by, are vague at best. It also may have been operated by the United Earth Space Probe Agency. It's simply hard to say. The other explanation as to why there could be varying sizes for the ship could be that although this vessel conforms to what appears to be a starship class, it may have been similar to the sort of space shuttles that have come earlier to it, and different people built it, although basically the same design. There were different reasons for it. Another thing we don't know is it is implied and indicated based on some sources and how famous this vessel seemed to be, that it certainly was some kind of exploratory vessel of some description, but exactly where it went and whether that is actually true, again, is a little vague. Other reports have this vessel as a sort of transport. That could have been, in my opinion, a later life use of an existing asset, though. Now, the only canonical source we have for where exactly this starship fits in the lineage of, say, ships called Enterprise is seen in the office of Admiral Marcus in a Splinter timeline. The ship is depicted in his set of models he has on his desk as being, which we assume based on the positioning of the other models, this was chronological in date. It was after the Ares 4, which was a probe that once visited Mars, and before Enterprise, NX-01, and other vessels of its ilk. Indicating, actually it was also before the Phoenix, I should point that out, indicating that this ship was pre-warp. Now again, there are some conflicting reports that this vessel may have either been retrofitted with a warp drive as a pre-existing asset, or, more interestingly, may actually have been an earlier attempt at some kind of fusion drive warp capability by humanity before the launch of the Phoenix, something that perhaps Zephyr Cochrane was either aware of or had even worked on before building the Phoenix. It could have been a failed attempt, much like the USS Excelsior was a failed attempt at transwarp. Or it simply worked but didn't work very well, and the Phoenix was the future of the technology, whereas this was a precursor design that simply didn't function right or didn't work properly. Or perhaps it only achieved relativistic speed but not superluminal, as in warp, going faster than light. It's simply hard to say. I know there's a lot of unsatisfying answers in all of this, in that we simply don't know. One thing, we don't even know how big this thing was. If we assume there was only one ship, the USS Enterprise, which is the one we always see depicted, if it was a prototype or a singular vessel and not part of a line of starships, and there was only one, that implies it was built for a specific mission. Now that mission must have had some kind of great importance, much like that of the Ares or the Europa missions that had come before it. But again, it's hard to say. The vessel was definitely built in space, that we can tell from its hull geometry, and it was built to stay there. Even if it was built in parts and shipped into orbit, it was definitely assembled in space and designed to stay in space. This ship we see on paintings and on posters and models on people's desks and in bars all across Earth. So that implies that this ship is pretty well known if people don't exactly know why. It's a bit like showing a picture of an old sailing ship, though, in my opinion. I don't necessarily recognize every sailing ship I see in a painting, but I do know it's like 17th, 18th century, generally. That could be the same here. This is definitely, almost certainly, a 21st century design. And it is implied that it's pre-warp, but it's fun to think that it at least did come with a warp drive in later years. Other explanations are that this vessel is sort of turn of the century, late 21st, early 21st century. That still doesn't conclusively prove that it had a warp drive. Not everything has to have a warp drive just because you've got that technology available. But it's heavily implied this was definitely one of Earth's first interplanetary explorers. That much we can pretty much conclude with certainty. It probably wasn't armed. It definitely didn't have shields or transporters or any technology like that. And it was one of the earliest vessels to definitely float around Earth's solar system. Whether or not it was a warp ship, like vessels like the Valiant, which are known to have been one of the absolute first warp vessels ever built by humanity that actually left the solar system and went off and did something of note, is unknown. So did it come before or after that? Hard to say. In fact, damn near impossible to say without more information. We can mostly chalk this up to people from the late 21st, early 22nd century didn't keep very good records. They maybe kept the data that was accumulated by these ships, but not much information on when they were launched. We do know by the time of the 2240s, humanity had lots of warp ships, and they were a bit more organized, but bear in mind, chaos of the Third World War was still something people had to deal with throughout the latter half, or the last few decades of the 21st century, before Earth really unified, and we see the formation of organizations like Starfleet, who maintain better records. In the formation of Starfleet, it's reasonable to assume that simply records were simply lost or destroyed because someone thought, we don't really need these, we're starting fresh. My speculation is this was probably originally built not as a warp ship, but was some kind of early experimentation in the technology. It was probably retrofitted with a functional warp drive later. It also can't be simply ignored that this vessel's ring-shaped design was obviously similar to that of Vulcan vessels, which again does hold to the argument, at least give some note to the argument that perhaps this ship was post-warp, and contact with Vulcan vessels, humans maybe flirted with the idea of a ring-shaped hull rather than using nacelles. But it simply didn't work. Also, the engine positioning on this ship is quite clearly along the main strut hull of the vessel, but those do appear to be thrusters or some kind of impulse thruster assembly, a very early version of an impulse engine. So if the ship does have warp, it's likely located in those rings, which would make sense because you'd want them away from the ship. Quite frankly, using a bit of speculation and a bit of inductive reasoning here, what other purpose do those rings have? I mean, aside, they're not stylistic, so they didn't put them on there just for it to look cool. They're likely one of a few things they could be. They'd partially be possibly some kind of deflector screening system. It's possible and even likely that they're used as some kind of heat ventilation system, as heat expulsion in space is quite important. They could be some kind of big radiators to get rid of some of the excess heat. It's also plausible that they are engines, and possibly, quite frankly, a combination of the three. It's unlikely they're used for habitation because they're a little slender, and access to them is a little precarious through one singular joint on the starship. In general, the vessel has a cigar-shaped appearance with an attaching pylon connecting to these large rings. It's very human in design in that regard, but it has what it looks like in its nose, some kind of navigational deflector system plus sensors. Again, it's probably not armed. It may have been, and if it was armed likely with missiles, railguns, or possibly early laser systems. And there's an outside, and I mean very outside chance, that maybe a plasma weapon. It's likely this ship saw service around the same time that all the freighters and other early warp cargo vessels and civilian ships were being launched from Earth, which is why I would say this ship probably did have some kind of warp propulsion capability. But to what extent and how fast it was is completely unknown. but it definitely, conclusively, was not capable of speeds in excess of Warp 2, as the Warp 2 barrier wasn't broken until the 2140s. So there's pretty much what we know about this fascinating starship, which is clearly an integral and important part of human technological development in spaceflight, but it's simply not been explored. Hopefully, records will reveal themselves in the future. We may even see, hopefully, some kind of exploration of this. Out of universe before we go, this was an early design concept for actual ships, both as filler for the background, but also a potential early design for the Enterprise itself. There were various different reasons this ship gets thrown around. Simply that it was an asset they had. They throw it up on the wall, and it was thought as set dressing, and no one really thought too much of it. But clearly, that's not how us Trekkies work. This ship exists. We want to know more about it. So basically, hop to it, CBS Paramount. Give us some more information about this rather cool and interesting and exotic looking human vessel. With that said, we're at the end of this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon. Tell me in the comments below what you think of this ship and where you think it actually does fit in the timeline. Was it warp capable? Was it not warp capable? There's simply too many both alpha and beta canon sources that contradict each other on this ship. As I said, in my opinion, I think it was not a warp ship initially, but was maybe an early experiment in interplanetary travel with a idea of a warp drive, which didn't work but later got retrofitted. That's what I'd like to think it was, simply because not everything has to have a warp drive. But it is entirely possible that it was actually built with a warp drive from scratch after Zephyr and Cochrane's warp flight. We're simply not sure. But if you've enjoyed this video, I thank you for watching, and we're now at the end. Bye-bye. I'd just like to say a thank you to everyone for watching that video. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoy making these. If you did enjoy it, please consider giving a like, share, and a subscribe, and maybe checking out the other videos on the screen right now, and in the description box below there are links to my other social media accounts.